Namaste, namaskar. Welcome to everybody. Today we're going to have a very exciting episode. It's something that everybody is going on. What news about the news? What's going on between Indo-China relations? So we have an exciting episode today with Dr. Subramanian Swamy and Shri Ananth Krishnan. Indo-China, the latest developments of Indo-China relations. It's going to be a pretty exciting episode. I'm kicked up for it. We have as our guest today Mr. Ananth Krishnan. Shri Ananth Krishnan is a China correspondent for the Hindu newspaper and is currently based in Hong Kong. He is a former visiting fellow at Brookings, India. Ananth was previously India Today's China bureau chief in Beijing between 2014 and 18, and a Beijing correspondent for the Hindu from 2009 to 14, and has reported from China close to a decade. He is the author of India's China Challenge, a journey through China's rise and what it means for India. It's published by HarperCollins. I'm pretty sure you can get it from Amazon and everywhere. I seriously recommend that you get it because it's one of the best books written on Indo-China relations. We also welcome Dr. Swamy for this. Obviously, he's going to be the lead speaker on it, and then our guests, Dr. Arvind Chaturvedi. Jagdish ji is joining us today from the aircraft, so he's a high flying on the move as ever. So he's joining us, but he can hear us, but not participate in today's session as his flight got diverted to Jaipur. Without much delay, I'm just going to get to Dr. Swamy. Just to make your introductions, and then you can go ahead and have an interactive session with Ananth Krishnan.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Ramesh. I'm delighted to have in our company here in this program Ananth Krishnan. He's a reputed intellectual scholar, author of books, as well as highly placed in a very important newspaper of India, and that is called The Hindu. And so to hear him, he will have a point of view, I'm sure, but we respect in our discussions points of view, even differing points of view, as you have seen in our programs. So let me ask him first 5 background questions that should be in his mind when he makes his initial statement, and afterwards we can have back and forth. One is, what does he make of the fact that Narendra Modi as Prime Minister and Xi Jinping as President met 1-to-1 18 times over the 5 years, 2014 to 2019, and yet today neither side is able to understand the other. What do you make of this? It's unprecedented that you meet so often. Of course, in addition to that, Modi made 5 extra physical visits to China. Now, second thing I would like to ask him, particularly as a journalist, why is it that the Prime Minister has declined to name China in any of his remarks? What is the strategy if he sees one, or what is the reason if he sees one? And if he has no clue, of course he can tell us also. Like me, we have no clue, so he can tell us. But I think it's extraordinary that by all accounts the Chinese have come across the LAC, taken territory, and the Prime Minister says nobody has come, nobody has gone, and has not taken the name of China, nor leave alone condemning China for its aggression. Third thing is that many scholars view that the one hand-to-hand combat that took place between Indian troops and the Chinese troops in Galwan went entirely to show that Indians are real fighters, and they did give a bloody nose, as many of us here are given to understand. But sitting from a distance and with a scholarly frame of mind, Do you have any idea about the importance of Galwan clash, if any? So this is the third question. Fourth is that almost everyone I know who has done a survey of the territory through either electronic means or having gone there as military men and come back on leave and spoken to me, they say that in area called Depsang, the Chinese are in very strong possession of it. It was on this side, our side of the LAC, and near the Karakoram Pass. So therefore, I think one has to examine why is it uh, that when they had come this far, as Depsang, why is it that we have not retaliated, or have we retaliated, and so on. And Depsang is very close to Siachen, and I'm hearing now that Chinese have got an intention to take Siachen. And finally, which is a very sensitive question, given your position and status and location, you are free not to answer the question. I am hearing that there are members of the Chinese government, whether it's in the party or in the military commission or in their other the parliamentary thing, which I think is called um, by a fancy name. I don't remember the name, but uh, there is a feeling that maybe Xi Jinping has gone too far, and maybe there should be some restraint, and so on. I mean, I'm hearing this question of some internal rumblings. Has he heard any such thing, and does he give any credibility or credence to it? So these are the five questions I would like to pose in the beginning, and the floor is all yours, Ananth.
Thank you so much, Dr. Swamy, for the invitation and for this platform. I've had the pleasure of knowing you for quite a long time and actually interviewing you as well, both on your book and when you had visited Beijing previously. Um, Thanks also for the five questions, which I didn't expect. As always, the unexpected questions from you, but I will make my best effort to answer them. Before I come to the five questions, I thought I'll just very briefly speak for five,
Yeah,
10 minutes,
yeah,
and
sure.
basically just try and give your audience a sense of, from my perspective, where the India-China relationship is now, where we go from here, what's the situation on the border, and also on the economy and trade front, which I know is something that you've followed a lot. Um, I think if you look at the most recent exchange that India and China had last week on December 6th, you had India's ambassador in Beijing, Vikram Misri, who finished his tenure, and I think he left today. And he had a farewell call with the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. And if you look at the readout from that, which you can find online, it's quite clear that it follows a pattern of a lot of the communications we've seen, where both sides seem to have a very different view of what led to the problem last year and how to solve it. The To put it very bluntly, the talks that they've been having, lots of rounds of talks haven't really achieved what they set out to. It's in a bit of a stalemate. The last round of military talks, the 13th round, was held on October 10th, and the 13th round ended with both sides in statements publicly saying the other was to blame. India said it put forward-looking proposals to address the situation, but it said that the Chinese had come to the talks without really having any proposals of their own, and pretty much shooting down everything India had come up with. There are some signs of progress. We don't know if it's how much. November 18th, the diplomats had met, and they've agreed to have the next 14th round of talks probably in the next 2 weeks. Where things are on the border, as you rightly pointed out, Depsang is one of key areas where both sides are yet to really disengage, along with Demchok, the hot springs area as well. There has been disengagement in Galwan Valley, which you mentioned in your introduction, as well in Pangong Lake in the north and south banks. Um, but the process, as I just said, hasn't really been completed. It's stalled. So you haven't really finished disengagement to even consider de-escalation, where you still have tens of thousands of troops from both sides along the border, which is a very new situation that we haven't seen since probably the late 1980s. I think the key point from India's point of view is that you can't really have normalcy until you've had disengagement and then de-escalation and a period of peace and tranquility. And without that, there's no going back to having a normal relationship, which is the message that India has been highlighting time and time again at every level. I think the highest level of communication we've had since the crisis is between the External Affairs Minister Jaishankar and his counterpart Wang Yi. We don't know how often or not NSA has been speaking with the top Chinese foreign policy official, who is the Politburo member Yang Jiechi. I think they've maybe officially spoken once, but we don't know if they've spoken. The other striking thing, you did mention that Prime Minister Modi has had more than 18 meetings with President Xi. It's quite striking they haven't spoken once since this entire crisis began, which is also, I think, quite important that you haven't had that top level communication. And we can speak about that later. If you look at what the Chinese have been saying, they've been saying in all their statements, they've been blaming India for what happened on the border, which I think all of us know goes against the facts that we know, which is in April 2020, to some extent, India was caught off guard by China mobilizing such a large number of troops and making these multiple transgressions across the LAC. But the official narrative in China has kind of flipped this around. Indian officials have said they haven't received any credible explanation for why China mobilized all these troops and did it. But what the Chinese foreign minister and other officials have been blaming India for everything, which is not really a surprise since that's their view of 1962 as well. I think that so that's the situation on the border. It's nowhere close to being resolved. We don't really know whether we'll have a recurrence of a clash. And I've only been talking about the western sector. The other troubling development we should also talk about is in the eastern sector. So there are three parts: there's western sector, middle sector, and eastern sector. We've had reports saying the eastern sector as well, there's been a big build up by China across the border from Arunachal Pradesh, both in terms of their military deployments as well as their civilian settlements that they've been building in some of disputed areas along the LAC. And that's another controversial matter, which you've had the MEA say that it is a serious issue, but you've had other officials try to kind of rebut this and say that all the constructions are on China's side. On the trade front, the most remarkable thing is this year, 2021, will be the first time
Yes.
that India-China bilateral trade will cross $100 billion. That's never happened before in history. And the
That's
fact that it's happening right now, when the relationship is at the worst it's been since the normalization of ties, since all that happened since 1976, that the fact that trade has reached the highest is it's quite a remarkable thing. And I'm not going to get into the details of the trade numbers, but what I will say is that in 2021, India will be importing more from China than it ever has before. That's machinery, electrical machinery, things needed for big projects, power equipment, a whole range of active pharmaceutical ingredients. So these are some of the things, auto components, things that we need for our solar sector. It's a huge amount of imports that are still coming, even though now and then you see headlines saying that there are boycotts that are working. I think the trade numbers provide a very different picture, saying that there really hasn't been a discernible decrease in the appetite for Chinese goods in India. Indian exports to China are also increasing, but whether or not that's a good thing is a big question mark, because we're still exporting very low-end sort of commodities like iron ore, organic chemicals, and things like seafood. And there isn't really a sense that we've broken into things where we want to export, whether it's pharmaceuticals or even in the IT sector, where there have been a lot of non-tariff barriers put in place by the Chinese that are still in place. So the trade situation is something worth looking at as well in terms of how we handle this contradiction, where on the one hand, you're telling China that things can't be business as usual, but then on the other, trade is going business as usual. Even though India has taken some moves, we must acknowledge the Indian government's taken some moves. For instance, before the border clash actually began, they put in place curbs on FDI to make it most difficult for Chinese money to come in. They banned Chinese apps. More than 200 apps have been banned, but and I think all of this was to kind of signal India's discontent on the border. But the actual imports and exports are still going as they are. A word on domestic sort of developments in China. Here I'll answer the last question that Dr. Swamy posed, which is, has Xi Jinping gone too far? I think the way I look at it is that the way they've covered, if you take the India China border as an example, you really see in how the Communist Party under Xi Jinping is really using nationalism as a way to get public support. When the Galwan Valley clash happened, India immediately acknowledged that we had lost 20 soldiers, but the Chinese didn't say anything for 8 months. It was only in February 2021 where they announced, where they said they've lost 4 soldiers. We have no idea whether they're more. They announced military honors for 5 soldiers, 4 of them posthumously honored. And what they did was they used that time to really conduct this huge propaganda campaign within China, which focused on, the PLA's sacrifice, and they emphasized how the PLA under Xi was defending Chinese territory and so on and so forth. So even if you look at just the purely domestic propaganda, whether or not we might think it's laughable the way they conduct it, but the fact is it's very effective within China. And so much so that most people in China do believe the official narrative. And I'd say that 18 months on, even though there's, I'll come to the next question on how India has handled this crisis, but the fact is within China, the standing of Xi or the party hasn't really been hurt by the crisis, I think, because of the way they've controlled information. We should add that those who have questioned the official narrative have been silenced. They passed a new law saying that anyone who insults the military will get a time in jail. And you actually had Chinese bloggers, more than a dozen Chinese bloggers, who put messages questioning, for instance, the death toll on the Chinese side, and they were all arrested. So they've been very tight in monitoring what's being said. So I think that we have seen recently there's a big Communist Party meet where they passed this big resolution that is for those of us looking on the outside, it seems very clear that Xi's grip is as strong as ever. But on the inside, it's quite frankly, I'll be honest and I'll tell you, I have no insight information into what's happening on the inside, especially sitting here in Hong Kong. I'm not in Beijing. And I think that what I'll say is there opposition to Xi Jinping, and is there a feeling he's gone too far? I think there's no doubt there is. Of course, there are people who are concerned about the direction things are going, both in terms of the Chinese economy and in terms of Chinese foreign policy, where there is, I think, a group of people who feel that China is premature in trying to take on the US, that China shouldn't be creating problems with India on its western flank when its supposed primary concern is on the eastern flank, dealing with the US, dealing with Taiwan. There are people who feel that. But in Xi Jinping's China, it's very difficult to see that expressed. 10 years ago, you would have debates on foreign policy in the Chinese press, but no longer now, where everyone is sort of saying the same thing. So my answer is, I'm sure there is unease and discomfort at some things, but it's difficult for us to know whether that's just a minority that's on the fringe, because it's those things can't be expressed. But I think looking at the most recent resolution and looking at the lead up to the next party congress in October next year, when Xi Jinping will begin his third 5-year term, I think for all intents and purposes, we shouldn't bank on him being sidelined or bank on him being weakened domestically. We should probably prepare for him being as strong as he has been the last 10 years if we're looking at it from India's point of view. In terms of, very briefly, before opening it up to you, Dr. Swamy, in terms of coming to some of your questions, I think it's a very valid question that you asked in terms of the engagements that we've had with China and what happened after that. So I think beyond the meetings that they had, many of which were in multilateral summits, the two big meetings that really got attention were Prime Minister Modi going to Wuhan for the informal summit in April 2018, and President Xi coming to Chennai in October 2019. Now, quite frankly, I would say if you just looked at the two summits in of themselves without what we know now about what's happening on the borders, I don't think you can really fault them for doing this because of the fact that China had never done this with any other country. And if just looking at it from an outsider's point of view, it seemed to be that by President Xi going to Wuhan, hosting Prime Minister Modi, which he'd never done for any other leader outside of Beijing, that and coming to Chennai, and he came purely for this visit, that it seemed they were investing in at least keeping relations stable. And one of the takeaways from Wuhan was that both had issued a quote strategic guidance to their militaries to keep the border calm. And the thing is, like post after the Doklam crisis in 2017 up until April 2020, it was the three among the three most tranquil phases on the boundary in the last 20 years after Doklam up until these incursions that happened in April 2020. So, what happened then is a mystery. Publicly, officials in Delhi are saying China has yet to give an explanation. There are a lot of theories going around, um, such as I'm not evaluating the credibility of the theory, but some that seem plausible say that after Doklam, when India crossed a settled border to go into Bhutan and stop the Chinese road building there, that the PLA was waiting to pay back in kind and waiting for the right moment to do so. There's also been sort of theories going around that the PLA, in China's military modernization, the focus now is on the Navy, on the Air Force, on the rocket force, and the budgets have been such that the army is becoming less and less important. There's no doubt about that if you look at the budget. And the only two unsettled land borders China has are with India and Bhutan. So, what other way for the PLA to show that it needs to be still at the center of China's military modernizations than have troubled borders? And there've also been sort of rumblings that they weren't happy with the move of the two informal summits of the attempt to stabilize relations. But having said that, Xi Jinping is in command of the army. Let's not assume that even if the army did something initially to trigger this crisis, let's not assume that Xi Jinping is not in command. Post May, June 2020, definitely after the Galwan Valley crisis, we can be sure that everything they've done since, the hardline posture on the border, is something coming with his approval, as he's the head of the Central Military Commission. What happened, frankly, we can all speculate why this huge investment in fixing the relationship ended up backfiring, not just for India, for China as well. So I think we should acknowledge that this process has been derailed for both sides. And there's a cost for both sides as well. In terms of why the Prime Minister didn't name China, I think that there's no doubt that the initial remark saying that the Chinese had not intruded was a big mistake. I think it was later they tried to correct it, but from looking at it from being here in China, it's something that's still being repeated by the Chinese media and Chinese experts, saying that because you had India's Prime Minister say the PLA didn't intrude, all of this land anyway belongs to China, so there's nothing to negotiate. So I think that was a bit of a costly mistake to have made, even if I think subsequently at the level of the foreign ministers, it's very clear that India has conveyed that China has transgressed the LAC and they must return to status quo. There's no doubt that the Chinese officials have that message. They know that India wants to return to status quo. But from the messaging point of view, I think it was a huge mistake, and there's no doubt about that. Finally, on you mentioned Depsang and India's scope for retaliation. I think that just looking at it from my point of view, and I think if you look at it objectively, one thing from this crisis is I think India has shown militarily that it can stand up to China by at least preventing further ingresses and transgressions from the initial phase where obviously India was not prepared. But since the summer of 2020, India has largely held the line. And I think that we have conveyed that at least on the borders that we can stand up to China. And I think that by taking the position that we won't withdraw and that we won't settle to go back to normalcy in the relationship until our conditions are met, I think that's the right thing to do, however long that it takes. And I think in terms of scope for retaliation, you did see that south of Pangong Lake. The only way that there was a disengagement in Pangong Lake was because India took the steps and occupied the heights south of the lake. And that was how we were able to get them to withdraw on the north bank of the lake. And to be fair, before that withdrawal happened in February 2021, nobody thought they were going to leave from Pangong Lake's North Bank because they built so much infrastructure. So I think India did show that it has the capacity to do these countermeasures, which I think is one reason why the Chinese haven't made further transgressions that they have in the past. But then you still have the question, why aren't they withdrawing? I think they're going to stretch this out as long as possible. And regardless of what the Chinese foreign minister says, I think they feel they are imposing a cost by India stationing so many troops in forward areas at a big financial expense. It will also have a longer term consequence on India's own military modernization. Of things that will come at the expense of obviously the Indian Navy. If you're going to be sucked into long term deployments on the border, the Chinese are aware that they are extracting a cost. So I think in that sense, it is a difficult situation that we are in. And Dr. Swamy, I think I'll end my introductory remarks there, and I'm happy to take further questions.
Well, I have, based on what you just said, some extra questions along that line. One short question. Do you think that the 18 meetings the two had, they ever discussed any disputes amongst the two countries as far as the border is concerned? Let me go back a little. I had some dealings with the Chinese. I went met Deng Xiaoping, which he would not meet anybody unless it was something special. He didn't even meet prime ministers. But in my case, I was invited to come and meet him, and he opened the Kailash Mansarovar route in that meeting. But he also said that we will normalize now and sent the foreign minister to Delhi, which of course Mr. Narasimha Rao was foreign minister at that time. I conveyed to him, and it happened that way. And I was part of all the proceedings that took place. Now, take you down the line. 1993, we worked out a LAC, which is now something everybody knows. That we are not saying that Aksai Chin is not part of India, but we are saying for the moment it's in occupation in the Chinese, and we'll keep that at status quo. Everything is a status quo. And this line either side will not cross. But they did cross. Now, did they cross before 2014 or after 2014 is my first question. And if they crossed before 2013, then Mr. Modi had discussions with Xi Jinping. Did he raise it or he didn't raise it? If it is 2020, you can say, well, the Chinese fooled you and they discussed everything. And then as soon as the talks were, this one-to-one talks were over, they did exactly what they want. But in the event that some of the defenses that are being put out is actually backfiring on us itself, to say that all this has happened before. So, was there any incursion across the LAC before 2014? To your knowledge, number one. Number two, we have so far been discussing the Ladakh side. Take the Arunachal side. There have been photographs come out about a village, full-fledged developed village to house the PLA people, and they are in our territory. That is, because in the east, McMahon line was never replaced. I mean, they kept saying it's disputed and all that, but they withdrew beyond the McMahon line into Tibet after in 1962. So it became a permanent line, and in fact, they settled with Burma on the McMahon line. They said so they gave it a new name, but they said that we accept the McMahon line as the international boundary. So I'm saying that in Arunachal, I don't know whether you have independent information, but there are people who are being discouraged from stating it, but there are people who say that the Chinese have made considerable progress in going beyond and headed southward of the McMahon line? So these are the two questions I want to ask you.
No, I think the both are really important questions, and it's right that you asked them. On the dealings between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi, just broadly speaking, Dr. Swamy, from my own sort of questions that I've had over discussing with diplomats, what is discussed, one thing that they often make a point of is that the Chinese try and avoid sort of specifics uh, at the level of Xi. The reason being that they try to present him as this, emperor-like figure, and the way they conduct the diplomacy is that someone like him would sort of deal with quote-unquote big picture issues. For example, uh, what is sort of the broad views of where the relationship is going, where can they work together, etc., but not specifics of how do you resolve the boundary dispute. So a critic would say, is it really, I mean, worth having these big picture conversations when you don't deal with the nitty gritty? I think that my own view is that at least the Indian officials who deal with China felt that it was useful to have that engagement because, to put it very, very bluntly and simply, talking is better than not talking. Um, and that they felt that in the Chinese system, it is extremely important to have, if she meets Prime Minister Modi, you're signaling throughout the system, right? You're signaling that they're dealing with India in a certain way, placing importance on India. It filters down to their companies, the state-run enterprises. So there's a sort of cascading effect of those interactions happening. So they aren't, without purpose. But on the LAC, I think there is no doubt, from my point of view, there is a serious problem when you had 18 months of a crisis and you haven't had a single conversation between the two. I think it's a very valid question to ask. What was the point of having that personal level engagement if 18 months into this crisis they haven't spoken once? And the way China works, you've had Xi Jinping and Biden recently had a virtual summit. I think that the new US administration has been insisting whether they deal with who they deal with in China is important. They don't want to just talk to people lower down the hierarchy for the sake of talking, because they've come to the conclusion that the only way you get things done is by talking to the people who matter. And ultimately, I think the relationship or the crisis is not going to be resolved, obviously, without Xi Jinping's consent. And I think it's a very valid question to ask, why haven't they spoken after having all these discussions when there was nothing really urgent happening? When you have the biggest crisis since the late 1980s, the fact they haven't spoken, I think, is a problem. In 2015, when Prime Minister Modi came to China, he did raise this whole LAC that you mentioned, that you'd come to this understanding of the LAC in 1993. You had another agreement in 1996, and you had a commitment by both sides to clarify it. So they exchanged maps in the Western sector, and then the whole process got derailed, I think, in the year 2000. So in 2015, you had Prime Minister Modi publicly say in a speech in Tsinghua University, which you know very well, saying that, it's time that the LAC is unclarified LAC is a shadow hanging over the relationship, and that both sides need to resolve it. But it was very clear right after he left. You had an official of the Chinese Foreign Ministry meet Indian journalists right after he left and say that they are against it, and that they feel it's adding another level of complication to resolving the boundary. So they agreed these border agreements. They have made very clear they had no interest in clarifying the LAC. I think you have Delhi still mentioning clarifying the LAC, but clearly I feel the ship has sailed, given that what they did in 2020 was to say no uncertain terms. They don't believe in clarifying the LAC, and they will go up to what they see is their view of the LAC. And so I think that whole clarification issue is something that's really gotten derailed. It's difficult to seeing it being revived right now. Um, so where it goes from here, I think that it's clearly, I think there has to be a big rethink in how we approach this issue and how we deal with them. And I think the high level communication is something it's a big question mark. You asked very, very rightly, if you had 18 meetings, why aren't they speaking now? And the other question that I think that you raised on the eastern sector, I think it applies to the western sector as well, is a question basically about transparency. And I think the point that you made is, I think the satellite images are quite clear that these civilian constructions that the Chinese are building are on Indian territory. But the response has been from those who are saying it's not a big deal, is they're saying that this territory, they are right in saying that this territory has been under Chinese control since 1959. It is true. And they are right that there are PLA military outposts south of these settlements. But why they're significant, in my view, having a military outpost on a land that is yet that we are still discussing with them officially, on land that is still under negotiation. Having a military outpost is one thing, because at the end of that negotiation, you can withdraw your military outposts. But settling a civilian population there is extremely significant because it's an entirely new step. And the
Yes,
Chinese are aware that the 2005 agreement says that any settlement of the border will take into account the interests of settled population. So what you are doing by settling populations in there is saying that there's nothing to discuss. So you have changed the status quo. It doesn't matter if there's a military outpost further south of that. So I think that it goes to the heart of this question is, are you more concerned about the reputation of the government, or are you more concerned about the actual territory involved? I think that, frankly,
right.
I think in terms of matters of national security, it should be. There's no question that I think it should be transparency first, and someone reporting on it for the last year and a half. There's no doubt that there's been this sort of reflex to try and play it down until you can no longer play it down, and then you have to say what's happening. We still haven't had much clarity on what was discussed on 13 rounds of talks. The statements are very brief and sparse. I think I think you're going down a slippery slope if if any official at any level is more concerned that saying something, acknowledging something is going to make the government look bad. If that means you're withholding information from the public on territory being lost,
Yes.
or the fact of how much territory India has actually lost access to since April 2020. You asked the question whether anything happened before 2014. Absolutely, there were incursions before 2014, but those were settled. They did drag on. You had Depsang in 2013, for instance. Throughout the 2000s, you did have those incidents, which were isolated events, and eventually both sides settled them. What you never had was a multiple sort of transgressions and a loss. I think we've lost access to multiple patrolling points, and all of
Yes.
these patrolling points we had access to up until early 2020. And I think a lot of former retired army officials have gone on record to say that, including in Depsang as well. So I think
Yes.
there's no doubt that there has been a change in the status quo in 2020 over magnitude that was far greater than what we'd seen previously.
Okay. One short question, then I'll ask my colleagues. They must be all very eager to ask you also, because you're one of the most well-informed people we all know. So we'd like to know from you. Have you heard anywhere in your capacity as a senior journalist of a very important newspaper, at least in China, it is very highly regarded newspaper, of Chinese moving from Karakoram towards Xiaqin. And I have heard, and I mean, I could be wrong. I mean, I could have been misled into believing a wrong thing, but I've heard that they intend to take Xiaqin in another 6 months' time. Now, are we therefore the business of going and attending BRICS meeting, SCO meeting, having a trade grow China's, and it's a trade which is against us in the sense that the balance of trade is in their favor, hugely in their favor. And I see now even ISRO is now involving the Chinese electronics. Even your cricket is relying on Chinese technology. And the Chinese have also told you that they fuse the electricity in Bombay, and to take a lesson from that. These are the exact words, at least in that what is that TV called GST or whatever they call it. In their TV channel, which they have said that India should learn a lesson from this, that we can do these things. So, short question then is this: do you think that this, everything is as before attitude should be given up, and we should say we are at war with China?
On Siachen, Dr. Swamy, to be frank, I haven't heard that, and I'd say that, I mean, you probably have better sources than I do. So that's but seriously speaking, more than that, I think that it gets to the heart of what's happening between China and Pakistan, and I think that there's no question that I believe that since 2013, when China launched the Belt and Road Initiative and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, that I think there was a sea change in how they looked at Kashmir and how they looked at the India-Pakistan relationship and balancing it. Because if you look at the last 20 years, there was a sense that the Chinese were not wanting to get involved in Kashmir. When the Pakistanis were trying to get them to raise it, they wouldn't raise it. They would officially say it's bilateral to be solved between India and Pakistan, but that's changed. If you look at their reaction to abrogation of Article 370, if you look at the way they raised it, the UN, if you look at the fact that China and Pakistan are carrying out joint patrols in POK. And I think that if you look at the BRI and CPEC, for all intents and purposes, that I think it's not overstating it to say that unofficially the Chinese regard POK as belonging to Pakistan, and that's a big change.
Right. Right.
And I think that that is a big change. And so I would say that that is significant in of itself, regardless of other things that might be happening. So I would certainly say that from India's point of view, the China-Pakistan equation is something we have to live with. And I think that if we were in doubt a few years ago about the Chinese waffling or the Chinese being worried about Pakistan's instability and the Chinese not wanting to get exposed to Pakistani terrorism, etc., etc., I think that we should probably now come away with the feeling that they are all in. I think on the Pakistan relationship, and that's something that India has to deal with on two fronts. And I think that that's here to stay. And even looking at Afghanistan, the way that they have been in sync with. If you had 3 days before the Taliban delegation came to China, Pakistan's foreign minister was there in China, and the way that they're in sync on all of these issues, I think we should be completely clear about that.
Okay. Arvind and anyone else wants to ask questions?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Ananth Krishnan, for giving such a good insight into India-China relations. I have different questions. My first question is related to geopolitics. You just mentioned about China-Pakistan axis. Now, it's not only China-Pakistan in my view, but what about China-Sri Lanka? What about China-Bhutan? What about China-Afghanistan? What about China-Nepal? I mean, all these neighboring countries of India are actually, the behavior is completely changed in last 2 years. And naturally, India is being affected. So do you think the direct relations between India and China is cold as of now? And China is playing with the India's neighbors?
Thank you, Dr. Sarabedi. I would say that I would put China and Pakistan in a different bracket. I think it's completely different equation than China, Nepal, or China, Sri Lanka. And because China and Pakistan are both, they have a completely different relationship in terms of the things that militaries do. And I think on Sri Lanka, I'll probably Dr. Swamy should weigh in, having recently been there and having access to their leadership. And I could be wrong, but my general sense is on one level, they don't want to be beholden to one country. And even for all that they do with the Chinese, I don't think I think there is a sense of concern or reluctance for them to be 100% a satellite of China. I don't think that's going to happen. Same with Nepal, where I think the difference is that the Chinese are more willing to get involved with domestic politics in these countries than in the past. You've seen that in Nepal, where they've been trying to cobble together coalitions and to get involved in internal politics. It's new. But I think that I would say that if you look at the neighborhood, it seems to come in waves where you have a lot of concern on what China is doing, then you have a change in government, and then you have exaltations that the Chinese have been defeated. But I would say that if you take a longer term view, I would say that it's inevitable that because of the economy, because of the trade, these countries will have closer relations with China. But I would also give you a different perspective and say that not everything that they do there means that it's going to be going to be negative for India's interests. If you look at Hambantota, the famous port deal, people were sort of wringing their hands in India about it, but then it ended up being this white elephant. So it's not that. I think from India's point of view, I think we'd be making a mistake to try and compete with them rupee for renminbi and try and be a China and waste money and splurge money there. Instead, I think that what India is doing now and trying to do is to come up with its own way of dealing with these countries, coming up with its own projects, sustainable projects, pointing out some of the problems with Chinese projects. We have these big companies come in, do big projects, often incurring a huge amount of debt. I think our sort of response should be to be different and not try to compete with the Chinese and be like China in these countries. So to put it very, very shortly, I think Pakistan is a case of its own, and we shouldn't be as alarmed by what's happening in those other countries, in my view.
I had a little just a minute,
Yes,
Arvind, can I add one thing to
Sure.
remark?
Yes, sir.
Of course, I've just maybe a month ago come back from Sri Lanka and was a personal guest of both Gotabaya and of course, more importantly, Mahinda Rajapaksa. And I've had a full-fledged discussion. Let me tell you the other side of the story. In the beginning, when Rajapaksa got elected, the first problem he faced was that both India and China were big debtors. I mean, Sri Lanka was indebted to them for loans that had been taken by the previous government. So what they suggested is that if India could sort of reschedule the repayment process so that they can clear the Chinese debt, and then they will pay India over a longer period. And I was personally present when Rajapaksa came here, Mahinda Rajapaksa came here to meet the Prime Minister. And the last person he saw was me when he called me for breakfast before taking off for Sri Lanka. And I continued that discussion. For till very recently, and now we have corrected it, we were absolutely obstructionists on the question of repayment. They said, no, you have to pay. And I traced it, surprisingly, of our bureaucrats' sensitivity to the American attitude to Sri Lanka. Do you know that the Americans have called a meeting of democratic countries? They have refused to call Sri Lanka, although it is a practicing democracy in the truest sense of the word. And of course, also Bangladesh.
Pakistan was invited.
And Pakistan has been invited.
Yeah.
The Americans have, at the top level, spoken to me, questioning me, why are you so friendly with Sri Lanka?
Okay.
They don't say that they are pro-Chinese. They say that they are a bunch of rascals. So therefore, the Chinese and the Americans don't like to be upstaged, and they think the Rajapaksa was harsher on LTT than the Americans had wanted. And in India, we had two groups. Sonia Gandhi wanted us to be very soft on the LTT, but Manmohan Singh, to his credit, on rare occasions, he supported the hard line. And we are now rid of that menace called LTT. So let me say that Sri Lanka is being forced. But recently, I credit the Prime Minister. He woke up to this. And of course, I've been bombarding him with letters and recommendations. But I'm not saying that he listens to those things. He makes up his own mind. And now the rescheduling process has started. So I am seeing that there is a possibility now Sri Lanka will be friendly. And we should take advantage now, because the Americans have humiliated them by saying that we will not allow Sri Lanka to participate in this concept. Why? Nobody knows. It's a democracy without doubt. So, sorry to take up so much of your time, but the fact is that the relations with our neighbors is partly our own making, including as far as Nepal is concerned. And we need to do special. See, you can't allow relationships to be decided by bureaucrats or bureaucrats turned ministers. It has to be somebody who understands the political nuances. And that's why we are making a mistake in dealing with these small countries.
Okay.
Yes, go on, Arvind.
I have one more question on business and trade. Mr. Ananth Krishnan, as you know, the Indian-Chinese diplomatic relations have been soured, or so to say, for last 2 years. We have had Prime Minister Modi declared even the banning of TikTok, the mobile app, and it was made a big show. The 32 apps of the Chinese were banned in India, and so on and so forth. And then there's a campaign by some fringe organizations that we should boycott Chinese goods and things like that. Now, in the light of this fact, or this background, what is happening on the business between India and China? It has been growing by leaps and bounds.
Yeah, that's right.
Import has gone up by 60%, and even the export has gone up. Now, on one hand, we are saying that China is not a friendly country to India, and therefore we should do that. And whereas the trade between the two countries is increasing. We know, of course, for the fact that the pharmaceutical industry in India depends largely on imports of APIs, that is active pharmaceutical ingredient from China. About 60%, 68%, or maybe slightly more. It has gone down over a period of time. Pharma's input depends on China's exports. So are we saying that in order to protect our pharmaceutical industry or some other industry, let's ignore the business part and let's keep on the diplomatic war?
I think that the thing is that on the imports and export side, you're absolutely right. And I think that one reason we have to wait and see whether 2021 was an exception, because you had all this pent up demand from 2020. And one argument is that the quantity of goods we're importing is more or less the same, but because of all the strange supply chain constraints you've had last year, that the cost of the same volume has gone up, which is why the trade figures are so high. But I think that the basic point it remains that those import dependencies haven't changed. And I think that the clear thing is there has to be a long-term strategy. For instance, whether it's manufacturing APIs, I think there've been lots of studies to identify areas that we're more sensitive to and find ways to either import them from elsewhere, even if that means the cost is going up, or manufacture them at home. And I think that's the way it begins. You have to have a long-term plan to address those questions. And you aren't going to get, I think banning apps will give you like a short-term sort of headline, but the real sort of challenge is going to be coming up with ways to address these things that can't be done overnight. Some moves which have consequence, you mentioned the app ban, for instance, keeping the Chinese out of 5G.
Yes.
I think that is a move that will have consequence and probably the right decision in the current circumstance, because for a company like Huawei or ZTE, it was a huge market and a huge potential billions of dollars that they had lost. I think the 5G decision sent a very clear message to China that it can't be what it was 10, 15 years ago because of the changed political relationship. So I'll say it's a mixed picture. They have taken hard decisions such as 5G. But on the other hand, I think there has to be much greater focus on what you're going to do long term to address those questions on how to end those dependencies. You mentioned APIs. I think that's one thing. For instance, we have such ambitious targets for instance on the solar sector, where to meet those targets that we have. Those imports are going to come from China. So you have to take a call which sectors you want to open up, or which sectors you want to sort of close off and wall off. And I think that exercise has to happen, and it's not going to happen overnight. And Dr. Swamy would know best on that.
Just one comment. You said about the cost of the import is going up, and therefore there's a jump. No, even in terms of volume, there is an increase. Number one. Number two, you talked about 5G. Only 2 days back, we had the contract between ISRO and Oppo
Yes.
for navigation. 2 days back, and everybody is surprised. People are raising eyebrows. What is happening?
Right.
No, I think
Well-
that the point that I would really want to make is that I think for the longest time, the way China has dealt with why you have these things happen is that for the longest time you have different sort of ministries deal with China, in silos, and you really haven't had I think it's a genuine concern where you haven't had a
The
holistic.
right hand does not know what the left hand is doing.
For example, the fact that you never had an approach where you've been one of the biggest markets for Chinese project contracting, uh, and you've been importing huge amounts of telecom and power equipment, but you really haven't linked it to, for instance, we have been negotiating with them in good faith about getting market access, and they've been saying yes, 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 but we've never really we haven't used the market like the Chinese have used their market, where they would say if a certain country wants to come in, they would have to do X, Y, and Z. But for us, it's been sort of because it suited telecom. Let's be clear, it suited telecom companies to have cheap Chinese equipment. So you had GOI policy allow it. It suited power companies to have cheap Chinese equipment, so you had policy allow it. But then on the other hand, GOI was still negotiating for our companies to go there, but that was somebody else's task. So you never had a holistic approach where for instance, on the investment side, you had Chinese companies come in and invest a huge amount of money into getting stakes in companies like Paytm is a big example, Zomato. All of the e-commerce companies have Chinese investment. But and you can argue that it was useful for these e-commerce companies to scale up. But then on the other hand, all of this was left unconnected to our own pending problems in accessing the China market. So I would say that there has to be an approach to try and have a holistic, trying to use trade and investment, use your market as leverage. I think those are things we must try and think about.
I've
I have one
reached
more
9
question.
o'clock.
And Dr. Swamy can also answer this. As you know, Mr. Ananth Krishnan, Dr. Swamy has been saying this and suggesting that Russia is a junior partner of China. And of late, just few last week, we had the visit of Mr. Putin, and India is trying to be friend Russia. And Dr. Swamy, of course, I would invite Dr. Swamy's comment for the benefit of viewers. Dr. Swamy said, we are junior partner of the junior partner of China. So do you think we are looking for friends globally, wherever possible, at whichever conditions possible, in order to counter China? Is it to counter China? Can it be done? Or is just a confusion in the external policy?
Yes, Ananth Krishnan, you would like to go answer first?
I don't think we are pursuing Russia. I mean, Dr. Swamy knows more than I, but the India-Russia relationship has its own logic. And I think even if you look at India's dealing with many of China's neighbors in Southeast Asia, I think that we have our own relationship on our own weight. It's not that everything that we are doing is a knee-jerk reaction to China. And I don't think that's what's happening. And I think if that was the case, that would be a mistake. And I honestly don't think Delhi is under any illusions about the Russia-China relationship. I think they know, but I think they're also right to keep. I mean, Russia is still a hugely important defense partner, and I think that they are right to pursue that relationship. Just as we have deepening relations with the US, with France, with countries in the EU. Just as it makes sense for us to have closer relations with Russia as well. And I think it's far beyond. Even if you look at the history of it, it's far beyond what India-China relations are going through.
I would add this much. There's nothing wrong with the normal relations between India and Russia. There's nothing wrong with commercial transactions of buying their weapons, paying them. We are paying them market price. There's no those days of paying rupees and all. It's all gone. We pay in foreign exchange. Um, but at the same time, we have got to keep in mind that if the United States is a country with which you want to have relations, and they have multiple problems with Russia. Tomorrow, Russia invades Ukraine. Is India going to condemn Russia for it? It's a huge thing for the United States. They may even go into military action. It's that serious. So, if you want the in terms of weapons, the Americans produce much better weapons than the Russians. The S-400 has electronics which are taken from China, and the first delivery, which led to delay of our prepaid contract, was to give it to China. So, as long as you don't expect the Russians to be a counterweight to China, I don't think that anybody in this country would quarrel having good relations with China, with Russia. So, therefore, the Russian thing should be only good bilateral relations. But that doesn't mean that we should expect them to side with us. In fact, when Putin came here, he ensured that none of them would refer anything to our border. This is completely different from what the Russians, the Soviet Union stand was in 1971. Today, Putin came, he didn't say a word against the Chinese, nor did he allow us to say a word against the Chinese. So, in a sense, and in Afghanistan too, the Russians didn't speak up for us, being left out. We were completely left out. And so we go with our eyes open. This is what I want to say. We have now beyond 9 o'clock, so I'll have to ask other people for short questions, then let him go. I mean, we can't torture him. No. Just a few more minutes, Ananth. What about the others? Would any
I
of
think
you?
Ramesh is not there today. Ramesh has left.
Ramesh is not there, and Jagdish is out of
Yeah,
reach.
yeah.
And so that Tejas Navalgund, does he want to ask anything?
Tejas, can you join? Yes. Do you have any question, Tejas?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Yes.
So I have
Go
one
ahead.
question. Recently, last month, we saw that Chinese, like PLA, on the border side, they carried out few drills on the military front in the Karakoram Mountains. So, what do you think they are like on the military movements, where they are proceeding to? Are they going for a war or preparing for a war? Because we see a lot of drills being like conducted in the mountainside. Like, what views you have on that front?
May I say that is a drill for going to Siachen? Okay. Do you have any comments on this, Anand?
I think that, see, they've been doing this muscle flexing. They've been having drills with more regularity than ever before in Tibet and Xinjiang, and all of that sort of signaling. And honestly, as to no one really knows when a drill leads to something else. The biggest example is how this all began in April 2020. You had annual exercises, which India thought were annual exercises, but then after the annual exercises, you had them divert two divisions that reached the LAC in 48 hours. So it's I'm no one to sort of predict what will happen. But what I will say is, yes, those drills are happening with more regularity and frequency than before. Also, their forward deployments, the infrastructure they're building. So I think that I'll put it very bluntly. So when you hear their diplomats say that India is a fellow partner, that you should have we share common goals and so on and so forth. I think the question to ask them is, if that's the case, why are you armed to the teeth and with every passing month, you're adding your presence to forward areas. I think that's a very clear signal
Right.
to India about where China sees the relationship going.
By the way, the um, at no stage did the Russians side with you in this dispute when Putin came here. So let us be very clear that like Jawaharlal Nehru found himself completely isolated in 1962. Let's at least go with our eyes open that this is a war that we have to do it ourselves. And whatever little bits of support you can get, you get it. If there is a war between India and China military, I don't think the Russians will give you anything. And the Americans may not support you, but they will certainly give you weapons. Whether you need them or not, that's a different matter. But the fact is that what you just said, let's be clear who our friends are.
Yeah.
Okay, I think Arvind, you better.
Okay, Dr. Swamy, just one comment on your last thing. Are we back to the non-aligned movement?
No, there's no non-aligned. Nobody's really to even non-aligned. You had people who are willing to be non-aligned with us, and we don't have anybody. We
you.
have to become a pole ourselves.
Correct.
It may take time, but this is the way to go.
Correct. And in the
No.
process, you may have several friends with you.
Yeah,
who can
they are friends. I knew those you make. I think Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Bangladesh, they would be friends. You know, I don't know why the Americans have developed such aversion to Bangladesh. Do you have any comment on that, Anand? The American attitude to Bangladesh?
I am as perplexed as you, Dr. Swamy, and I think that this democracy summit as well had a few. I don't think they planned it as they should have. Their sort of reply as to why some were invited, some weren't. They said it was a limited guest list, but I think it really sort of backfired in some ways. And I think that I think to me, it just showed that the Biden administration really has to kind of get its act together. They've been slow to nominate ambassadors and fill up posts.
Yeah.
I think that I think it sort of raises questions about whether they've thought through what they're doing.
Right. Okay, Arvind,
thank you,
over to
Mr.
you.
Ananth Krishnan. Thank you, Dr. Subramanian Swamy. We were discussing latest developments in India-China relations, and the situation is so dynamic that every week there is a change, and there is no permanent situation. I mean, nothing, no stand which India can take and say this is the permanent stand between India and China. Situation is changing, and both of you, Ananth Krishnan and Mr. Dr. Swamy, both of you are expert on China, and this insight which you provided today to our viewers is really valuable. Very much. Thank you. Thank you, Ramesh Swamy, for starting the program, though he's not there. Jagdish could not join us today. And thanks the technical team headed by Ashish Shetty, Gadgi Rakesh, Ishwar Iyer, Tejas, Swaminathan, Vishal Mehta, and Ajesh Nair. We will be meeting next Sunday again, 8 p.m. Words of Wisdom Gyan Ganga program with a different topic, Dr. Subramanian Swamy, and maybe a different guest. Thank you very much, all of you, for being with us. Thanks, the viewers, for supporting us. We'll be meeting next Sunday again. Till then, namaskar, Jai Hind.